Okay, so we are here today. Again, we are going to be talking about producing products. We are in Unit 3, Chapter 10, as far as different production processes that we're going to go through. Uh, Most of these are what we refer to as casting, molding, or forming. So you can see some of the key terms here in this unit is metal casting, die, slip casting, forming, forging, extrusion, blanks, net shape manufacturing, and rapid prototyping. So you guys will need to get to know what all those terms are. Our objectives here today going through this is to describe the casting processes, describe how molding is used to shape plastics, and identify forming techniques and their uses as well. You can see here down at the bottom, so we gotta have a casting picture here, a molding picture here where they're kind of have this mold of a plastic bottle, and then some metal forming as well. All right, so let's define casting, molding, and forming. Casting and molding basically involve either pouring or forcing material into a molded shaped part that you get out. Casting generally refers to metals and ceramics. If we are talking about molding, generally that's referring to plastics and rubber. Your materials, doesn't matter which, whether you're using metals, ceramics, plastics, or rubber, those materials need to be in a liquid or what we refer to as a plastic state in order to go into the mold. Now, when it's mentioning plastic state right here, that does not mean plastics like we're talking about it. We're just talking that they have plastic type properties where they're a little bit more malleable to manipulate. All materials have a plastic state. You can look at those and get those particular specifications in different types of uh, articles and in different types of material specifications when you're looking at properties of alloys or properties of the different plastics. We get much more involved with how we use those charts and use all those material properties in the industrial materials class. So basically what it gets to is when we're talking about these materials being in a plastic state, that material is kind of softened where it makes it easier to work with that material. All right, there are 5 casting and molding steps. First, we got to make a mold. Secondly, we've got to prepare the mold. Third, then we're going to fill the mold. After we have filled the mold kind of is released. We let it cool off. That hardens the material, and then we can remove the workpiece from it. So let's think about some examples here of some products made by the casting process. Now remember, casting is generally referred to, and when we're talking about casting, that generally is referring to metals. Um, and the other question that I'm asking you here is what are some of Decatur's local companies that use this process as well? So we do have several companies here in Decatur, Illinois that use this. So as we sit here and think about some examples of products made by the casting process, we can talk about engine blocks in the automobile industry. Those engine blocks might be cast iron, they might be aluminum, depending on what the specifications for the engine is. We've got all sorts of products here. Railways use these. Machine tools might use castings with cast metal. All sorts of different types of machinery. Um, we can even get into the medical industry with different types of joint replacement. You all familiar with home fittings and plumbing fixtures and so forth in sanitary market. And it might even just be casting metal for artwork as well. So those are several of the different possible products that could be made using the casting process. Here in Decatur, of course, Caterpillar uses metal castings for a lot of their component parts. So does Mueller. Of course, they are different. Mueller's typically going to be using more brass and bronze in their foundry process. Caterpillar is going to be using more cast iron, gray iron, and other types of steel products. Voestalpine, also known as Nortrac, they are company that manufactures stuff for the railroad industry, largely your train track that goes on there. They do a lot of this over there at their plant. And of course, we have Decatur Foundry as well that specializes in gray and ductile iron and other types of alloy castings as well. All right, so let's get a little bit more into casting metal. Basically, when we're talking about metal casting, we are pouring molten metal into a mold of some sort. That material then cools and hardens into the desired shape. So it is one of the most widely used manufacturing processes to make metal parts. It's very fast, efficient. Generally takes a while for us to get the molten metal, and this is kind of a continuous process too, because of the long times that it takes to fire up and get that metal to be molten. These are continuously running; they don't really slow down, because then we would have problems with the actual molten metal um, cooling down in the actual furnace, and then that would cause problems as well. So these can be used to make complex shapes for fairly low cost in comparison to some of the other methods to make these. These molds are disposable or permanent. That usually depends on the quantity of the parts that are needed. So we're going to talk about three different types of molds here and whether they're disposable or permanent as we go. All right, so here are the three most common methods for casting metal: sand casting, investment casting, and die casting. And we're talking a little bit about each of these particular items. So sand casting is a low-cost method. So it uses disposable molds that are made from sand. Basically, your sand is mixed with binders, usually some type of binder of oil or other types of material that helps to pack that sand in tight. And then a pattern is pressed into the sand to create a mold cavity. These are generally used to make very large parts, although they don't have to be. We can use sand casting for all sorts of different size parts. One of the other things, if you think about the fact that this is a molten metal being poured into sand casting, a lot of times surface finishes are not going to be really smooth. They are going to kind of have a little bit of a texture depending on the coarseness of the sand and how fine grained that sand is when we make that particular casting. So here are a couple of examples. You have access to this particular PowerPoint. You can click on these links in that PowerPoint and they'll go to a YouTube video that kind of shows you those examples. For sake of time, I'm going to give you the option to do that on your own so you can learn a little bit more about that process. We also have investment casting. Investment castings are used for more complex shapes, and they're also used when a greater degree of accuracy is needed for those, as opposed to sand casting. This is also what is referred to as a lost wax process. So in the mold making procedure here, generally they would use wax to form the sand around a wax pattern. Then, of course, that mold is heated up and the wax is melted out, leaving the cavity so that the metal can be poured in. So it's called a lost wax process because we lose the wax that is actually a replicated part that's in there. Investment casting requires a lot more steps, so it's a little bit more labor intensive, a little bit more costly than your sand casting. Your mold here is still disposable, so we will still basically have to break off or remove the material of the mold from the actual part once the part's hardened. So because of several of these conditions, the fact that it does require more steps, it is a little bit more expensive than sand casting. So, and again, here's an example. You can click on that and see the example. All right. Die casting is probably one of the most accurate of these. It's also the most costly of the three methods. So it uses a permanent mold. So in order to justify this, you've got to have a large enough quantity of parts needed to justify the expense to go and make a permanent mold. In this case, a die is used to shape the metal into the certain form. And that metal is then forced into the dies using high pressure. So this will produce a high quality part, and it makes them very quick. So if you think about like your well, just think about your Hot Wheels or Matchbox cars. Those are largely dies that are needed. All right, when we're talking about casting ceramics, they use a process called slip casting. Basically, you take the clay or other types of material and you put that into a slurry, what's called a slurry mix, which is the particles of ceramics suspended in liquid, usually some type of water. That's slurry is what we call a slip, and you pour the slip into a plaster mold. As you let that sit, the mold absorbs some of the liquid, uh, and then you pour out the remaining liquid after a certain amount of time. That gives us what we call green part. The green part is allowed to stay in there to kind of harden somewhat. After that, it's removed from the plaster mold and then dried and fired in a kiln. And that firing process is what we call sintering. All right, here's some example die cast, and here's examples of casting ceramics. All right, so we're going to stop the video here. I'm going to post this, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about molding plastics and composites.